right, I would say that we are ready. So once again, welcome everybody to our digital workshop. Good morning to you and good afternoon for those of you that are following from the other side of the ocean. Today we have a very interesting and insightful conversation with Ben Kruse from AT&T. Hello, Ben. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. And hello to everyone joining us as well.
So today the conversation is about beyond surveys, how to achieve a defensible materiality process using AI. And this is a challenge for a lot of professionals in the field. And we will learn from Ben how they address this challenge and this task at AT&T. But before going in the discussion, let's share a couple of housekeeping rules. You can use the Zoom chat box or tweet with us, use at Datamaran AI to ask your questions. We will make sure there is some time at the end of our workshop to have the Q&A. If you have any technical questions, you can use the chat on Zoom to talk with us or email our marketing team. And of course, the event is recorded for those of you that couldn't attend live. A few sentences about me and Datamaran for those of you that don't know us. So I'm Donato Calace, the VP of Innovation Accounts at Datamaran. Datamaran is a cloud-based platform that uses natural language processing to analyze a variety of publicly available sources, including corporate reports, mandatory and voluntary regulation, news and social media. And we are the only solution that leverages natural language processing to analyze these variety of sources to identify material issues, emerging risks, and opportunities. We work with many of the Fortune 500 companies that leverage our system to identify and monitor material issues and build their materiality assessments. Now, let's go back to the agenda for today. So the conversation with Ben would be structured in two main segments. There will be a first segment that is more conversational. So Ben will explain to us what are the reasons behind their analysis, what were their goals, and how they distributed the insights internally. And then the second part will be more hands-on. So we will actually see the analysis that AT&T built, and so that Ben can explain to us why they took certain the decisions and what were the insights that they learned from the analysis. But before actually asking Ben to tell us more, I would actually like to engage with our audience and launch our first poll to kick off the conversation. So our first poll is actually asking, what is the most value generating part of a materiality assessment? I'll give some seconds for the audience to respond. And you know, the theme of this webinar is beyond surveys, because often materiality assessments are equated to stakeholder engagement or just running a survey. But there is more to materiality assessment than just running a survey. And we want to understand actually what are those aspects that you believe are important and are actually helping generating more value. So among the answers, we have external stakeholder engagement, board and executive engagement, defining the scope of reports, identifying risk factors, and developing strategy. So it seems we have a good majority, like 40% of the respondents that indicated identifying risk factors. The second item in line is developing strategy. and then we have board and executive engagement. So external stakeholder engagement seems to be very lagging there. Ben, what do you think of these results?
That's interesting. So Donato, I'm not able to see the graph from my view, but you said identifying risk factors and strategy were the top two. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. You probably can.
I think that's interesting. Obviously, when you think of developing a materiality assessment, many people consider it kind of, a requirement, if you will, right? It helps define the scope of your reporting. It's almost like the obligatory, step in that process in many cases. And so I think the real value of a materiality assessment is when you push the envelope of that and you dig a little bit deeper and try to get more meaning from that. So, obviously identifying those risk factors, I would add opportunities in there as well, because not everything, should be looked at from a risk perspective. But I think that's really important. And then the developing strategy, that's a key piece, I think. And that's something that AT&T has tried to do by taking our materiality assessment process, to the next level. So not only does it guide our proactive reporting, but we use those inputs to really help us understand our programmatic work, where do we need to reprioritize and maybe shift resources from a legacy program in a new direction. It helps us prioritize our financial investments in programs, and so on. And it's a great proof point for discussions with other business units across the company as well. So as we're looking at potential new programs, as our CSR organization is researching, different things, and we want to go out to the business and identify a business unit partner, a materiality assessment and that broad assessment of stakeholder interests is a really valuable part of that conversation, I think. So interesting results. As I look at the entire list of potential responses here on the survey, all those things are important. But so that's interesting.
But if you were to pick one, also based on your experience, what was for you the most value-generating part of your assessment?
I think, as I mentioned, that strategy, the developing strategy, is really key, I think, for us. Again, where we were trying to take those insights and really apply them and glean value. I will stop and say, though, the second option down, the board and executive engagement, that was a really interesting thing for us as a part of the materiality assessment process. So the way AT&T conducted that is we did live interviews, with our executives. And so we convene a CSR governance council that is 12 to 12.5 officers from across business units throughout the company. We use that population, folks that are already familiar with our CSR work, to dig in and talk to them about their perceptions of the initial list of material topics that we identified. And so those were very free-form, very qualitative discussions, right? And there was a lot of value gleaned from that. And so I think that was just really interesting. So there can be value found all the way through a materiality assessment process, but the ability to sit down and engage with officers in that direct qualitative conversation was a really valuable part for us.
Excellent. And was it a goal that you had since the beginning when you were structuring the process, the engaging with the board, or was something that you actually it was sort of emergent from the process?
It was something that we had done in prior materiality assessments. It was also recommended by the agency that we engaged to help us through the process as well. But I will say, you never know what's going to come out of those conversations and what people's perceptions are. And so I think that's always a surprise, right? Because you're not sure exactly, what people's opinions are. Or what I thought was interesting is several of our officers kind of lumped the topics together, right? So especially as we look at, environmental impacts, GHG, energy management, and so on. And then we also had just climate change in general, identified as a topic. And so it was just interesting to hear them talk through individually how they lump those various topics together, how they consider them, and so on. For example, one of our material topics is technology innovation, or perhaps the technology revolution. Obviously, super important to a company like AT&T is we're on the cusp of 5G and all the evolutions that are coming as a result of that. Some really interesting insights where they viewed that as almost paramount, right? Because if a company like AT&T, if a telecom can't get the technology innovation piece right, that's foundational to everything else that we do, and really is what gives us the capital to invest in all the other ESG work that we do. So that was just an interesting thing. So I thought that was a super valuable part of the exercise.
Mm-hmm. And of course, my next question is, and also linked to the title Beyond Service. You didn't take I would say a traditional approach to materiality. We worked together on it. So you leveraged big data, NLP. Was the investment in technology actually useful? Did it make a difference?
Yeah, I think so. One of our main goals, right? And maybe I'll take a step back before I get into that. So AT&T's been reporting in the ESG space since 2007. We've aligned to GRI since 2008, and so this last materiality assessment that we finished in fall of 2019 was actually our fifth materiality assessment. And so typically we've been on about a 2 to 3 year cadence with that. We waited to do this last materiality assessment just a little bit as we were finalizing our merger with Time Warner, into our Warner Media collection of companies. We brought Xandr, our advertising arm, into the business, and so we wanted to make sure that the dust settled, on those organizational changes before we launched this next assessment. So that was a key piece of this, right? This is the first time that we were going to be engaging those stakeholder groups. And in many cases, those were audiences that we hadn't necessarily talked to before. And so what we liked about the Datamaran solution was, I think it was several things. One was, to your point, the reach of the technology. So the ability to, bring in inputs from, mainstream media, from social media, from, regulatory activity, from, peer reporting. All of those things are super valuable, and in a traditional methodology, require hours and hours of desktop research, to do all of that work. It's a very, very manual process. And so we like the ability to cast this very wide net in a very efficient way. And so that was terrific. And we also like the fact that the platform allowed us to kind of then plug in what you might consider a more traditional way to do a materiality assessment. So we built customized surveys for several different stakeholder groups, for our B2B customer base, for our consumer customer base, for CSR or community programmatic partners, a large, number of groups. Investors was a part of that. And so we actually went out and surveyed 26,000, stakeholders. And so that was great to be able to have the system receive that data back and integrate that into the calculations. And then the qualitative conversations that I mentioned before with the officers in the company, we were able to take those qualitative discussions, convert them into some sort of a quantitative, analysis, in terms of prioritizing the material topics, and load that into the platform. And it was great because it allowed us to have all of these different methodologies right there within the platform. It made it very, very efficient, I guess is probably the best way to say it.
Excellent. And, I really like how you put it, Ben, because I think one of the key elements and takeaways from, this idea of going beyond service is that also understanding that materiality is not really just about getting the opinions of stakeholders, but getting data-driven evidence that something is important, is relevant for your decisions. And that evidence can assume many different forms. It can be in regulations, in news, in peer reports, and so on. And that, having that body of evidence just makes your analysis much more credible and robust in the AI. So, the board or investors as well. So I think this is an important takeaway for our audience. And in the next segment, it will be even more tangible, as we will show actually what the analysis looks like. But before going there, I would like to call our second poll. So the second poll is, what is the biggest pain point when it comes to materiality assessments, which is a bit the elephant in the room from the conversation that we had so far, Ben, because we discussed about how beautiful and how useful is the materiality assessment, but it's also quite difficult, especially if you want to be serious about it. So let's see what the audience think is the main challenge when conducting a materiality assessment. Let's wait a bit more seconds. I see results coming in. Okay. So it seems, do you see the results as well, Ben?
I don't on my screen, but go ahead and just kind of...
yeah, I'll read those for you. So the different options that we had were time-consuming, expensive, subjective or limited information, backward-looking, or other. So nobody picked other. So it seems that we had we did a good job in selecting the options there. But the vast majority, so 48% of the audience actually indicated that subjective or limited information is the biggest pain point. And the second one is time consuming. So I think it kind of reflects what you said before, right? The fact that data to create a materiality assessment comes in an unstructured way, essentially. And if you want to gather it, it can take a lot of time. What was the pain point for you? What would you say?
Yeah, I think all of these things were considerations for us. We have, a limited window in terms of, time to conduct, an exercise like this. We typically begin planning for our reporting cycle, looking through that lens for a little bit, in the early November timeframe. We go out to our business in mid-January and begin collecting data. And it's our goal to publish our ESG reporting no later than the end of May in a typical year. And so my point is that gives us, kind of that June window to November, is our window where ideally we would conduct a materiality analysis like this. And so, as I mentioned earlier, trying to bring in or expand your reach and bring in groups like peer reporting and news, regulatory, all that desktop research, that takes a tremendous amount of time. And so I think that's one of the things that was really attractive to us, to the Datamaran platform, is the ability to do that in an automated fashion, pretty much in near real time, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was really, really valuable because it allowed us to shorten, that research window, certainly for that initial step of identifying that core list of material topics, and then you can very quickly get into the next stage of the assessment where you're actually doing those measurements and so on with stakeholder groups. So I think that was super helpful for us. The subjective or limited information, I think that's also interesting as well. I agree that as you're doing a traditional survey, right, you're asking folks to prioritize from among a list of topics. You might give them the opportunity to add a qualitative response. Traditionally, a very small percentage of respondents do that. So it's difficult to get this sort of, background rationale for why a respondent might have prioritized topics in one way. The officer qualitative interviews that we conducted, that was very beneficial. And then I'll say the research from Datamaran, not only did it prioritize topics, right, but then it gave us links directly to that source information. So, for example, if you're pulling in a peer report, right, and you want to see what one of your corporate peers is reporting, within the tool, you can very easily see those documents and highlighted within those documents that key text, in the native format. And so all that background justification, if you will, all that perspective is captured within the tool if you want to drill down and go a little bit deeper. So I thought that was really, really helpful as well. And then I'll touch on the last one just while we're in the process. From an expense perspective, materiality assessments, they're an investment, and time is a function of that. In many cases, if you do it in a very traditional way, you're talking at a very, very multi-month sort of engagement. If you're bringing in agency support, time equals money, and so I think the ability to kind of foreshorten some of that process was very, very helpful. I will say that at a high level, the combination of the Datamaran platform and then the agency support that we brought in to help us pull everything together, the combination of those was very much in line with what a traditional agency-only expense might be. So that was great. You can pick up these benefits from an efficiency perspective and the visibility into the data, and not feel like you're spending a lot more money to do so.
That's great. I think this is a lot of practical advice for our audience. But now we can take things next level and really get into the engine room and have a look at your analysis in Datamaran. So I'm logging in the system right now. You can see the dashboard, and Datamaran, as I mentioned at the beginning, is articulated in different data sets: corporate reports, mandatory and voluntary regulation, news, and social media. And our analysis module actually builds an analysis, materiality analysis that leverages the insights from all these data sets. So I will load the results of your analysis, Ben. And the first output of the analysis, of course, the matrix visualization. I will explain a bit what the audience sees here, and then let you comment on the results. So on the vertical axis, you have the relevance that the different stakeholders, as represented by our data sets, but also the data that Ben and the team uploaded to the system, are giving to the different issues. Whereas on the horizontal axis, you have the perspective of the company. So of course, the issues in the top right quadrant here are defined as highly material. Then we have a medium band here in the middle, and then the low material topics. But more interesting than the visualization per se is actually the table of results here, which is a real scorecard which gathers the universe of issues that the AT&T analyzed in the first column, and then the ranking of the relative importance of the issues across the different data sets that AT&T analyzed. So as you can see, it's a very rich analysis. And Ben, so what were the learnings coming from the analysis? Was all these data useful, and how did you use it?
Yeah, thanks, Donato. So no, I think it's great to have all this, very rich statistical support and so on. I will say, if you don't mind, scrolling up to the matrix a little bit. I'm a visual person, so that tends to help me a little bit. So it's always interesting to see the topics, plotted, relative to each other. And so, many outputs here, I think we would expect, obviously for a telecom, customer privacy and network and data security, the reliability of our network, those are all table stakes. I talked earlier about technology revolution or technology innovation. Again, you would expect that to be key for us. But it was interesting to see, topics like employee diversity, equality, and inclusion, right? Obviously, very front of mind, to us all at the moment. But great to see topics like that are ranked, very highly. I think we might have been a little surprised to see some things like, climate change and GHG emissions, along with energy efficiency. To see a disparity between those, I might have expected to see them a little bit more in lockstep. So kind of interesting. taking a step back, I think at a broader level, I want to point out as well, for this matrix view, this represented a little bit of a methodology change for us with this assessment as well. So for all of our prior materiality assessments, we've used more of the 4-quadrant approach. And I think folks might traditionally think, okay, I really need to focus my reporting in that upper right quadrant, those topics that are important to both groups. And there's been some public dialogue on this as well recently. I think this concept of banding is really interesting. And in this example, we don't have any topics that appear, at the extreme far upper left or extreme, lower right. But I think those areas are important, right? Because they represent topics that might be of extreme importance to that external stakeholder group or to that internal organizational stakeholder group. If you stick with that traditional 4-quadrant approach, you lose the relative importance of topics in those areas. And so this banding takes that into account. So I like this approach and this view, even though AT&T might not have had topics that fell in those areas. I think that is really, really interesting.
Excellent. And talking more about the matrix visualization, I'm sure you read that GRI right now is reviewing their universal standards, including the prescriptions for materiality assessments. And in their new proposal, the references to materiality matrices are not there. So what you think is going to happen? Are materiality matrices going to disappear altogether, or there will be something else?
Yeah, I don't know that they will. And you heard me say it a moment ago. I personally am a visual person, right? And so as much great data there is in the data table, on the lower portion of this window, for me, being able to visualize this and see the topics plotted out on the matrix, that's what's most helpful to me. It's great to have that statistical support, but as you are trying to digest the data, as you're having conversations with other business units across the business, or as you're planning across the CSR organization or other organizations, being able to visualize the relative importance of those topics, I think, is super helpful. So we also, like many others, we post our materiality matrix on our website. And so, to easily be able to communicate the results of this to external stakeholders, I don't see getting away from a matrix like that. Maybe the matrices or matrices look different at some point, but I don't know. I don't see us getting away from it.
Mm-hmm. I tend to agree with you. So one of the most frequent questions from practitioners is actually how to define the universe of issues that you want to analyze. And we can see here we have a universe with between 20 and 30 issues. I don't recall the actual number right now. But those issues are also articulated in different subtopics. So what kind of advice can you give to practitioners when it comes to creating this universe of issues? How do you ensure completeness there?
Yeah, I think it's very dependent on all that advanced work. It's that research that in a traditional methodology is desktop research. You're looking at peer groups, you're looking at the regulatory environment, whatever. As I mentioned, Datamaran kind of helps automate or speed up that process a little bit. But some advice: don't forget to use your own company as a data source for that as well. So, for example, AT&T conducts some reputation measurement on an ongoing basis, consumer awareness of our CSR programs, and how that affects their perception of AT&T and our reputation and so on. So we use that as an input. We used our historical CSR reporting as an input. We used some brand measurements and so on as an input. So my point being, the external sources are great, but don't forget the company itself as an internal source. So an example, the second one down here, building digital skills. If you think of a traditional telecom, you might not think of that topic as percolating up, through external sources. education and reskilling, support of STEM-based learning or whatever, that's been one of AT&T's key philanthropic focuses for, the last decade or so. And so that was really important that we represent, that focus and that line of work. Very, very specific to AT&T, and not something that Datamaran might have uncovered, natively. So I think that's my advice, right, is allow the system to do the work, allow the research to do the work, but don't forget to include things that are unique to your business that are material to you.
Excellent. And I think the other element that really, draws the attention when looking at this table of results is that you have a lot of sources. And as you mentioned, you leveraged also internal sources there, which is, I think, it's an important takeaway for our audience. Again, beyond surveys, it means from a data perspective that you can rely on much more evidence than just interacting with your stakeholders. But so what was the decision driving you to adopt all these sources, and what were the learnings? What was the next step once you built this data-driven analysis for you?
Yeah, so this was an interesting part of the process as well, and part of this was guided by the agency that supported us. Although I think lots of people do this as a part of a materiality assessment, but we compiled a value chain map. So and it's challenging for an organization that is the scope and complexity of AT&T, right, to consider all the different stakeholder groups that are out there. And so obviously, there are the expected, there are the employees, there are the customers, but we tried to delineate between consumer customers and B2B customers. There are suppliers, there are investors, those sorts of traditional stakeholder groups that you would think of. But then as we looked at how the business was evolving, as we've expanded into the media and entertainment business and advertising business, we identified stakeholders like content distributors, some groups like that. And so where we landed was with a collection of, 10 or 14 or 12 or 14, stakeholder groups. So an incredibly broad, collection of people. But that value chain map and taking the time to take a step back and look at all the different parts of the business, I think was critical for us to be able to ensure that we weren't inadvertently leaving a stakeholder group out. And so I thought that was really, really interesting and valuable.
Excellent. So now I think the next segment is really a sort of live experiment, let's say, because this data and the analysis that we have here, it's the analysis we conducted over the last year. So it's not, I would say, the most recent data. As we know, a lot has happened in the meantime. So of course, what we will do now as a sort of live experiment is refreshing the data, what has changed. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, but before going there, before going to this third segment of our conversation, I'd like to call our third poll to see what actually the audience thinks, and see if they think over the last 6 months there has been a change, a shift in the material issues that we've seen so far. A lot of every time I engage with experts on materiality or practitioners in materiality, there's always this argument, but we don't see much change over time, or we tend to see every time the same material issues, which is a bit counterintuitive, I'd say, in a context like this. So I'm very curious to see what the audience thinks right now. So results are coming in. Do you see the results as well, Ben? So the question was...
I'm eager to hear, what's it looking like?
So the question was, have you seen a shift in material issues over the last 6 months? The majority, 73% of the respondents answered yes. There is also about 1/3, I would say probably closer to 1/4, 27% that said don't know. So it seems that the majority anyway expects a change in the importance of issues. So I'd say let's look at the data. That's the beauty of having a data-driven approach. That besides expectations, we can actually see what the data tells us. So we launched this year a monitoring functionality that actually is able to track what were the shifts, the largest shift in the ranking of importance of of the issues, including analysis on the vertical axis. So the system will load the data right now, and we can get this nice view of palm trees to remember us that we're close to the summer break. Yep. Still loading. Right. There we go. So the monitoring functionality actually takes the issues of your analysis and points you to the top 5 issues that have had the largest increase over the last six months, and also points you towards the sources that actually originated this shift. So we can see that the 5 issues that over the last 6 months changed their importance are geopolitical risk, which went up 8 ranks in your analysis, mainly because of mandatory regulations. So there are new mandatory regulations that affect this issue. And an important note here, in geopolitical risk, we track pandemics and epidemics. So I guess that's not extremely surprising. And then we have employee health and safety and well-being, intellectual property, employee diversity, equality and inclusion, and human rights. So Ben, anything surprising here? What do you think of these updated results?
I not really, especially when you indicate that geopolitical risk includes, the pandemic and the COVID, measurements. Certainly we're seeing, other sorts of similar risk, in areas of our Latin American business and so on. So that is not surprising. Employee health, safety, well-being, diversity, human rights. Many of those could kind of center into this topic of human capital management. So very, very front of mind for lots of folks right now. Certainly, how companies are making accommodations for their employee base, in a post-COVID environment. So those I'm not surprised by. IP infringement, that's an interesting one. So it'd be interesting to kind of, dig into that at some point in time and see what the drivers are, there, and see if that's a function of, the media part of the business or what is driving that. But so that's, if any of these stand out, that one is potentially a little standout.
Yeah, it's probably the one that you wouldn't expect, right? And according to the data, what we have here is that the increase in the ranking depends on the analysis of your distributors and the all peers benchmark. So basically, those companies are reporting more on it. So it would be, I agree with you, interesting to see what is driving, what are the implications of this.
Yeah, and Donato, I might mention again for AT&T's analysis specifically. So all peers, as a part of our stakeholder identification process, that peer group is customized for us. So that is not necessarily just telecom peers. Our board identifies a list of peers that we list in our proxy, other large corporations that we monitor and such. We pulled in peers in the telecom industry, we pulled in peers in the media and entertainment industry. So that group is probably a larger population than folks might typically think of as AT&T peers. So just an interesting note in terms of ways you can customize groups like that.
Right. And I think, this monitoring capability gives us the opportunity also to share considerations on beyond service, because I think there is a different meaning to beyond service in this case, because the monitoring that we're looking at right now, of course, it goes beyond just the analysis that you do that goes in the report, because you did your materiality analysis, you put the matrix in the report. So what would be the value of doing this kind of monitoring analysis? Why do you think it is useful?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely plays into, strategic analysis, an analysis of emerging issues, and just trying to be a step ahead if it's possible, right? In terms of the next evolution of programmatic development, or ways you might want to enhance or tweak, existing programs. So it just gives you a really valuable window into that. And companies do this sort of research in all sorts of ways, but this is just a great tool to assist with that.
Thank you. And I'd say it's probably, putting my academic hat on a bit, I think it's also a nice way to represent, these recent notions of dynamic materiality, as well as, issues. Materiality is not really a state of being, but more a process of becoming, and being able to track how the evidence of materiality builds over time. I think it's a great way to anticipate things, as you correctly indicated. So I would say, go on, please.
Yeah, just to expand on that a bit. And so I think with any research like this, right, you have to take it somewhat with a grain of salt, in that, it is dynamic, and some of this isn't directly represented on this screen just yet, but as I took a look at other topics that shifted, as we looked at this refresh of our materiality assessment, some of the environmental topics in the refresh dropped in position. So things like e-waste and energy efficiency and so on. And I think given what's going on in the world right now, that's potentially understandable where some of those topics might drop relative to others. But I think that's a temporary phenomenon. It's not to say that the world is holistically thinking different about environmental sorts of programs or investments. It's right now the social side is taking precedence, and so you're seeing a little shift there. So to your point, it's ever evolving and so on, and so you kind of have to look at the results and go, why is that happening, and do I think it's a permanent trend, or is it temporary? So.
Right. Yes, I agree with you. The data is actually showing that there is an emergence of social issues over environmental one. If this trend is going, to last, or being just, a reflection of the contingency, I guess we will see. Probably there are some elements, especially in relation to the debate around diversity or working from home as well, that we stick with us. So it's hard to say where things will go, but hopefully the data will help us to make reasonable and educated premonitions in that sense. All right, so I will now open the conversation to our audience. So I'll stop sharing my screen. We can just be featured in the video to have a more direct contact. And I'll start looking at the Q&A that we are receiving. So Matthew Gardner is asking, it's a technical question about the relative weighting of the data sources. How did you weight the different sources, Ben? What was the rationale behind it?
Sure. So I will say that is, by definition, kind of a subjective process, right? And so, we tried to look at, among the stakeholder groups, which groups are probably most familiar with the topics that we were prioritizing. We looked at, the survey responses that we got back. So as I mentioned, we invited 26,000 people to participate in our survey. We received just north of 1,000 surveys back, so 4%ish or whatever, which is pretty good. But there might have been, different subsets of that surveyed population that had different response rates. So, we might have bumped up the stakeholder weighting for a group to accommodate for that a little bit. So those were the types of things that we were thinking about as we were doing that work, but it's not, it's very subjective. So that's something those sorts of decisions were made, in committee with a large number of people, to talk through and make sure that it made sense and so on. Just to add some rigor and governance to that process. It certainly wasn't, any one person sitting around and making those determinations. But so hopefully that helps. And Donato, I don't know if you all have experience with how other clients have handled that as well. That'd be interesting.
So I think, the experience with other clients typically reflects with what you just said. They tend to decide the sources, weights based on their, committees, conversations, but also, with a critical eye to, what those sources represent. Are we really weighting a tweet as much as mandatory regulation? They're not exactly the same thing. From our perspective, from Datamaran perspective, we give some recommendation for the weighting, but we don't have a one-size-fits-all, just because, for two reasons mainly. We're not really in the position to make that decision for the company, meaning, saying that a tweet is more important than a mandatory regulation. There may be instances where that is true. And second, from a, conceptual and technical reasons around materiality, materiality is really a company responsibility, because it's the heart of accountability. So the materiality decisions and judgments should be really in the hands of the company. And I think part of that is also assigning different weights to the stakeholders. So we have another question. You mentioned before that you also used surveys for your analysis. How did you structure the survey?
Sure. We tried to keep them pretty simple, right? And so I'm trying to think back, because it's been just a little while since I've looked at them. But, we had, I think, approximately 4 different survey buckets where we might customize the language within the survey just a little bit. Obviously, we might phrase things differently for a consumer customer audience than we might a B2B enterprise customer or an investor, for example. But we tried to keep it to 2 or 3 questions, asking them, and we had 29 or 30 topics, right? So, I mean, it's very difficult to get them to, prioritize a list that is that large. So we had subsets where we would break it down and so on, but trying to keep it, under 5 questions or so people didn't get burnt out. I will say the platform allowed us to, capture partial responses. So if people answered a piece of it and decided to close out or whatever, we were still able to capture that partial response as well. There was definitely a qualitative text box where we could add them or allow them to add some rationale behind the scenes. That tends to be a very small percentage of respondents, take the time to do that, but it's valuable insight to gather. So that's at a very, very high level how we structured it.
Excellent. So as I see that we're approaching the final minutes, there's another question coming in. Do you think that the shift in the issues can influence your strategy? So I think this refers to the monitoring piece that we've seen at the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an input, right? And I'll tell you, we're in the process right now of building new long-term goals as we look past 2030 and so on. So the timing for a refresh like this is perfect, right, to give us insights into that. And so, yeah, the short answer is absolutely.
Great. So as I was saying, I think we're approaching the final minutes of our conversation. And if there are no more incoming questions, I would like to ask you, if you were to give a piece of advice to all those that are approaching, materiality analysis in these months or in the next months, what would that be?
don't overlook the value of the process, right? And don't sell it short. And we've talked about that, for the last hour or so, in that, there's so much more value to be had from the process than just that snapshot in time, just that obligatory process that tells you what to report, in your annual reporting. So take advantage of the strategic insights, and that background, justification for how the results, come out. That's very, very valuable. The other thing I'd say is what makes a platform like Datamaran, I think, helpful, especially for, perhaps smaller organizations that might just be getting started on the materiality journey, is it allows you to do all that front-end research, in an automated fashion. I mean, it really would allow a company to conduct a materiality assessment entirely on their own. Like I mentioned before, we brought in an agency to help support us. Part of that was, to supplement, headcount, and other parts of that were to provide guidance and to help us interpret the data, help us manage the interviews with our officers and so on. But certainly the platform is built in such a way that, a smaller organization could conduct this, entirely on their own and have a very structured and very reliable materiality assessment with all the data to back it up. And so I think it's a great starting point, or a great option as a starting point to someone just beginning that journey.
We have another question here. Should materiality assessment be prioritized in a time of global crisis? Budgets are tight. This is a very practical question, I would say.
It is. No, I think so. I think it is one pillar or one part of strategic research that any company is likely conducting. And so, I think it would be amiss to, not to be, actively investigating what stakeholder opinions are and what stakeholder inputs are. But again, I would imagine everyone is still continuing to conduct research. Everyone's monitoring evolving issues. This is just a part of that.
Excellent. Well, Ben, I'd like to wrap up thanking you for your availability today. And I think what you just said about, thinking to materiality beyond, just the matrix and the snapshot that goes in your report, it's a very crucial piece of advice, and also ties back to the theme of our webinar, going beyond surveys. And I think you explained that very well. I'm sure the audience has a lot of takeaways to go on with, where they're already on because it's virtual. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Donato. I appreciate it, and thanks to everyone who joined.
Thank you for the audience for joining us, and see you next time.